By sunrise, Clara Whitaker would either save her husband's land, or watch it disappear forever. In the winter of 1800 deep in the cold mountain country, Clara stood alone on a small farm that seemed to be dying right along with her hope. She was only 33, but grief had aged her in ways no mirror could fully show. 2 years earlier, her husband Thomas had been taken by a sudden illness, leaving behind the land they had loved, a stack of unpaid debts and more trouble than one woman was ever expected to carry. Every morning, Clara woke before the first light touched the hills. She walked past the broken fences, the damaged cornfield, and the old barn where the wind slipped through rotten boards like a warning. The frost had burned through her best crop, turning her only chance at paying the debts into a field of dead leaves. The cattle were hungry. The stored hay was shrinking fast. Even the roof over the animals looked ready to give way. There were no children to help her, no close family willing to stand beside her. The hired hands came and went, staying only long enough to earn a quick coin before leaving for richer farms. People in town whispered that Clara should give up. They said a farm was no place for a widow fighting alone. But Clara did not answer them. She simply tightened her shawl, looked over the land Thomas had died protecting, and kept working. The winter did not arrive like a season. It came like an enemy. Each morning, when Clara Whitaker stepped outside, the ground cracked beneath her boots, stiff with frost, hard as stone. A pale white crust covered the fields, glittering in the first light like something beautiful from a distance, but up close it was nothing but ruin. The corn, once tall enough to brush against her shoulders, had withered into bent, blackened stalks. Leaves that should have promised harvest now lay curled and burned by the cold, scattered across the soil like the ashes of a dream. That field had been her last real hope. If the corn had survived, she might have sold enough to pay part of what she owed. She might have bought feed for the cattle, hired help for the barn, and bought herself a little more time. But the frost had taken the crop without mercy. It had moved through the farm in silence, leaving Clara to wake up and discover that weeks of labor had been destroyed overnight. She stood at the edge of the field, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and forced herself not to cry. There was no time for tears. Not with animals waiting. Not with debts growing. Not with every hour of daylight already claimed before it began. The barn worried her even more. The old beams groaned whenever the wind came rushing down from the mountains. Some of the wood had gone soft from years of rain and neglect, and the roof no longer held back the cold. At night, the wind slipped through the gaps and moved over the cattle like icy fingers. Clara would hear them shifting restlessly in the dark, their bodies pressed close together for warmth, and she would lie awake knowing that if the barn failed, she would lose more than shelter. She would lose the herd. And without the herd, there would be nothing left to save. The haystack behind the barn had shrunk faster than she expected. Every morning she counted it with her eyes and felt her stomach tighten. The animals needed more than she could give, but the pastures were stiff and dead under the frost. There was no green grass, no soft earth, no sign that the land remembered spring at all. Still, Clara kept moving. She carried water until her arms burned. She patched holes with scraps of cloth and broken boards. She checked every fence, every gate, every weak corner of the property, as if determination alone could hold the whole farm together. Her hands cracked from the cold. Her back ached before noon. By evening her legs trembled as she climbed the porch steps. But she never stopped. Because stopping meant admitting what everyone in town already believed. That the farm was too damaged. The winter was too strong. The debts were too heavy. And Clara Whitaker, widow or not, brave or not, could not fight all of it alone. Yet every night before the fire burned low, she looked through the window toward the dark outline of the fields. Somewhere beneath that frozen ground was the land Thomas had loved. Somewhere beneath the silence was the life they had built together. And as long as Clara could still stand, she would not let the winter bury it. But winter was not the only thing pressing against Clara Whitaker's door. There was a man in the valley who had been waiting for her strength to fail. His name was Colonel Silas Blackwood, and everyone in the county knew what happened when he wanted something. He owned broad pastures, mule teams, storehouses, mills, and more land than most men could ride across in a single day. His name carried weight in every shop, every churchyard, every quiet conversation held near the courthouse steps. People lowered their voices when they spoke of him, not out of respect but out of caution. For years Silas had wanted Clara's farm. Thomas had refused him every time. Back then, Silas had come with polite words and measured smiles. He claimed he admired the land. He said he wished to make a fair offer. But Thomas always saw through him. He would stand on the porch, one hand resting on the rail, and say the same thing each time. "This land is not for sale." Now Thomas was gone. And Silas Blackwood had returned. Only this time he did not come with kindness in his voice. He came with papers, deadlines, and men who delivered messages like threats, wearing clean boots. One of them had ridden up earlier that week, stopping at Clara's gate without bothering to remove his hat. He handed her a folded notice and told her the matter was simple. If the debt was not paid before winter's end, the farm would no longer belong to her. It would pass into Colonel Blackwood's hands. Clara had held that paper long after the writer left her fingers stiff from the cold. The words were plain, but they struck deeper than any storm. Payment due. Final warning. Property claim. She knew what Silas was doing. He was not trying to help her, he was waiting for the frost, the hunger, the broken barn, and the empty fields to finish what his money could not. Then he would step in with a low offer and call it mercy. He would say he was saving her from ruin while taking the only thing Thomas had left behind. The worst part was that others believed him. In town, when Clara bought salt or nails or medicine for the cattle, she could feel the eyes following her. Women whispered behind baskets of flour. Men paused outside the store and watched her load supplies with hands red from work. Some said she should be grateful the colonel was willing to offer anything at all. Others said a widow had no business fighting over land she could not manage. Clara never answered. She had learned that loneliness could be loud, especially when it came disguised as advice. Still at night, when the wind shook the walls and the fire burned low, fear crept in. What if they were right? What if Thomas had believed in something she could not protect? What if love and hard work were not enough against a man like Silas Blackwood? Then she would remember her husband's voice. There is more value in this land than people understand. Clara did not know exactly what he had meant. Not yet. But she knew one thing with a certainty that warmed her more than the dying fire. Silas Blackwood would not get this farm because she was tired. He would have to take it from a woman who still knew how to stand. So Clara Whitaker did the one thing everyone in the valley thought she was too weak to do. She kept saying no. No to Colonel Silas Blackwood's money. No to his warnings. No to the soft voices in town telling her to be reasonable, to stop fighting, to accept what little he offered before she lost everything. Every time one of his men came riding up the dirt road with another message, Clara met him at the gate with her back straight and her hands rough from work. The answer never changed. The farm was not for sale. But courage did not make the days easier. When Clara went into town, she could feel the judgment before she heard it. The mercantile would grow quieter when she stepped inside. Men who had once nodded to Thomas now looked past her as if a widow carrying a sack of salt was something embarrassing to witness. Women at the counter lowered their voices, but not enough. She should take the colonel's offer. She'll lose it all anyway. A woman alone can't run land like that. Clara heard every word. She heard them when she paid for nails with the last of her coins. She heard them when she asked for medicine for the cattle and saw the shopkeeper hesitate, wondering if she could still afford it. She heard them outside the blacksmith shed when two men laughed and said Thomas had been stubborn in life and now his widow was being stubborn in his place. Still, she did not turn around. She loaded what she had bought, lifted what others thought too heavy for her, and started the long walk back toward the mountains. Sometimes, halfway home, the weight became more than the sack in her arms. It became the silence of the empty house waiting for her. It became the cold bed, the unpaid debts, the dead corn, the barn roof groaning in the wind. It became every voice saying she was foolish for trying. And in those moments, Clara would stop by the roadside and look toward the far line of her fields. She could almost see Thomas there. Not as a ghost but as memory. His hands resting on a fence post. His shirt sleeves rolled up. His eyes fixed on the land with that quiet certainty she had never fully understood. This place is worth more than they know, he had told her once. Back then she thought he meant love. Family. Years of sweat pressed into the soil, maybe he did. But now, with Silas Blackwood circling like a wolf and half the town waiting for her to fall, Clara wondered if Thomas had known something more. Something buried in the history of the land. Something the colonel wanted badly enough to hide behind smiles, notices, and false mercy. That thought frightened her. But it also steadied her. Because if Silas wanted the farm that much, then surrendering it would not be peace. It would be theft. So Clara went back to work. She mended fences with numb fingers. She carried water until her shoulders burned. She stood in the ruined field and planned for a spring she was not sure she would live to see on that land. The town could pity her. The colonel could threaten her. The winter could test every bone in her body. But Clara Whitaker had already buried the man she loved. She would not bury his dream while she still had breath in her chest. That afternoon, the wind came down from the mountains with a sound almost like a warning. Clara Whitaker had just finished hauling 2 buckets of water from the well when she stopped near the front gate to check the fence line. The old posts had been leaning more each day, and one hard storm could have torn the whole section loose. She tightened her shawl around her shoulders and bent to test the rail. Then she saw movement on the road. At first it was only a shape in the dust, slow and uneven, coming through the gray winter light. Clara stood still, one hand resting on the gate. Travelers sometimes passed that way, but not often. Her farm sat too far from the busy roads, too deep in the hills for strangers to arrive by accident. The figures came closer. There were 3 of them. A man walked in front carrying a worn cloth sack over one shoulder. His coat was thin, his beard untrimmed, and his boots were covered in road dust. He moved like a man who had been walking for days, maybe weeks, but there was something steady in him. His body looked tired. His spirit did not. Behind him came two small boys. The older one held the younger child's hand. Both wore clothes too light for the cold, and their faces had the pale, hollow look of children who had gone too long without a proper meal. The smaller boy stumbled once, and the man quickly turned, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder before they continued. Clara's heart tightened, but caution kept her silent. In lonely country, kindness could be dangerous. A woman alone learned that quickly. She had opened her door before to men who smiled too easily and asked too many questions. So she waited by the gate, watching the strangers approach, her fingers wrapped around the cold wood. When they finally reached her, the man removed his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough but respectful. "My name is Samuel Reed. These are my boys, Noah and Caleb." The children did not look up. Samuel swallowed hard, as if pride itself had become something painful in his throat. "We had a small place of our own once," he continued. "Not much, but it was ours. A fire took it. The house, the barn, the tools, the crop, everything. Since then, we've been walking from town to town looking for work wherever someone would give it." Clara looked at the boys again. Noah, the older one, tried to stand straight like his father. Caleb clutched a small sack to his chest as if it held the last piece of his whole world. Samuel's eyes met Clara's. "I'm not asking for charity," he said quietly. "I'm asking for milk and food for my sons. Just enough to get them strong again. In return, I'll work. And if you let me, ma'am, I'll help save this farm." For a moment Clara could not speak. Save this farm. She looked past him at the dead cornfield, the broken fencing, the failing barn, and the winter sky pressing low over everything. This man had no horse, no wagon, no tools of his own, no money. Only 2 hungry children and a promise too large for the cold road he had come from. It should have sounded impossible. But then Caleb lifted his tired eyes, and Clara saw no trickery there. Only hunger. Only fear. Only a child waiting to know whether the world still had mercy left in it. Clara opened the gate. "Come inside," she said. And without knowing it, she had just let hope walk onto her land. Clara Whitaker did not open that gate because she believed the man's promise. She opened it because 2 children were standing in front of her with hunger written across their faces. Samuel Reed stepped onto the farm slowly, as if even crossing the threshold required permission from the land itself. Noah followed close behind him, still holding Caleb's small hand. The younger boy kept his cloth sack pressed against his chest, his shoulders tucked inward against the cold. Neither child spoke. They had the quiet of children who had learned that asking for too much could make adults turn away. Clara led them across the yard toward the house. The wind pushed against their backs, rattling the loose boards of the porch and carrying the sharp smell of frost from the dead fields. Samuel glanced once at the broken fence, once at the sagging barn roof, once at the blackened remains of Clara's corn. His eyes moved carefully, not with judgment but with the habit of a man who knew how to read trouble. He saw more in one walk across the yard than most people in town had seen in months. But he said nothing. Inside, the kitchen was warm. The wood stove had been burning since early afternoon, and the small room held the kind of heat that made a body realize just how cold it had been. Caleb stopped near the doorway, staring at the stove as if he had forgotten such warmth existed. Noah stood beside him, trying to act older than his years, but his hands trembled when Clara took the empty bowls from the shelf. "Sit down," she said gently. The boys looked at their father first. Samuel nodded. Only then did they climb onto the wooden bench near the table. Clara poured fresh milk into tin cups. She cut thick pieces of cornbread, placed cheese beside them, and ladled hot beans into bowls. It was not a feast. On another farm it might have looked simple. But to those boys it was everything. Noah tried to eat slowly at first, as if manners could hide starvation. But hunger broke through before pride could stop it. He took one bite, then another, his eyes fixed on the bowl like he feared it might disappear. Caleb held the cup of milk in both hands and drank with such desperate care that Clara had to turn away for a moment. Something inside her hurt. Not because she had lost food she could barely spare. Because she knew what it meant to have the world shrink down to survival. Samuel remained standing until Clara placed a bowl in front of him too. "You and your boys will eat," she said. He looked at the food, then at her, and for the first time the strength in his face nearly broke. "Thank you, ma'am," he said quietly. His voice carried more than gratitude. It carried shame, relief, exhaustion, and the kind of love that makes a father swallow his own pride, so his children can live. They ate in silence at first. The only sounds were spoons against bowls, the soft crackle of the stove, and the winter wind pressing against the walls. Clara watched them and thought of the promise Samuel had made at the gate. Milk and food for his sons. And in return he would save her farm. The words still seemed impossible. What could one man do against dead crops, rotten beams, shrinking feed, and Colonel Silas Blackwood waiting for her to fall? Samuel had no horse, no money, no hired men. His clothes were worn thin. His boots looked 1 long mile away from coming apart. Everything he owned seemed to fit inside a cloth sack. Yet, there was something in the way he looked around the room. He did not look like a beggar counting what he could take. He looked like a man measuring what could still be repaired. When the boys finished eating, Caleb leaned against his father's side heavy with warmth and sleep. Noah fought to keep his eyes open but his head kept dipping toward his chest. Clara stood, took 2 folded blankets from a shelf and pointed toward the small room near the back of the house. "They can rest there tonight," she said. Samuel lowered his gaze. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I don't ask to stay for nothing. Give me a few days. Let the boys get their strength back. I'll work from before sunrise until dark. I can mend fences, repair roofs, fix tools, rebuild what others would throw away." Clara studied him. Outside the farm groaned under winter. Inside 2 children slept with full stomachs for the first time in too long. She did not know if Samuel Reed could save her land. But she knew this turning them away would have cost her something no debt collector could ever measure. So she gave him a small nod. "Then we start in the morning." Samuel looked toward the dark window where the broken farm waited beneath the cold. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Morning will be soon enough." That night after the boys were asleep, Clara Whitaker remained in the kitchen long after the fire had settled into red coals. The house was quiet but not the same kind of quiet she had lived with for 2 years. Since Thomas died, silence had filled every room like another kind of winter. It sat at the table across from her. It followed her down the hallway. It waited beside the cold side of the bed where her husband no longer slept. But tonight that silence had changed. From the back room came the soft breathing of 2 children finally warm enough to rest. Every now and then one of them stirred under the blankets and the old floorboards answered with a faint creak. It was such a small sound, almost nothing. Yet to Clara it felt like life returning to a house that had forgotten how to hold it. Samuel Reed sat near the stove, his hat in his hands. He had offered to sleep in the barn but Clara would not allow it. The barn was too cold, too broken, too cruel for any man who had walked that far with children. So she gave him a place near the kitchen hearth where the warmth would last until morning. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Samuel looked toward the dark window. Clara could see his reflection in the glass, a tired man with dust still clinging to his coat and worry carved deep into his face. But there was peace there too, fragile and new, the kind that comes only after a parent knows his children will not go hungry that night. At last he said, "I know you don't have much to spare." Clara folded her hands around her cup of weak coffee. "No," she answered honestly. "I don't." Samuel lowered his eyes. "Then I owe you more than work." Clara studied him across the small room. She thought of the cornfield lying dead under frost. She thought of the cattle waiting on less feed than they needed. She thought of Colonel Silas Blackwood's warning folded and hidden in a drawer as if paper could not still burn a hole through her life. She should have been careful. She should have counted every cup of milk, every piece of cornbread, every blanket. She should have remembered that winter did not forgive softness. But then she remembered Caleb's hands wrapped around that tin cup, trembling so badly that drops of milk ran over his fingers. She remembered Noah trying not to eat too fast, trying to protect his pride while hunger won the battle. She remembered Samuel standing at her gate, not begging for himself but asking for his sons. And Clara knew the truth. There are moments when saving what you own means nothing if you lose who you are. "You don't owe me for feeding children," she said. Samuel looked up and something in his face shifted. Not surprise, exactly. Something deeper. As if he had expected the world to keep charging him for mercy. Clara rose and placed another piece of wood into the stove. Sparks lifted then disappeared. The room warmed by a few degrees, but it felt like more than heat. It felt like a decision had been made, one that neither of them fully understood yet. Outside, the farm remained broken. The fences still leaned. The barn still groaned. The fields were still ruined. The debt was still waiting. Nothing had changed in the eyes of the world. And yet everything had changed inside that house. For the first time in years, Clara was not alone at the table. For the first time in weeks, Samuel's boys were not sleeping hungry beside a road. For the first time since winter began, the farm held more than fear. It held a promise. Not the grand promise Samuel had made at the gate. Not yet. A quieter one. That kindness, even given by a woman with almost nothing left, could open a door no force could break down. That a warm meal could become the first stone in rebuilding a life. That hope did not always arrive dressed like victory. Sometimes it came in worn boots, carrying 2 tired children, asking only for milk. Clara glanced once more toward the back room, then toward Samuel. "Rest while you can," she said softly. "Morning comes early here." Samuel nodded, but his eyes did not leave the floorboards beneath his boots. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "And tomorrow, I start paying that kindness back." Before dawn, Clara Whitaker woke to a sound she had not heard on the farm in a long time. Work. Not the tired, desperate kind she had been doing alone for months, moving from one problem to another until her body gave out. This sound was different. Steady, purposeful. Wood shifting against wood, a rope pulled tight. The soft strike of old iron against frozen ground. For a moment, Clara lay still beneath her quilt, wondering if grief had finally started inventing things for her to hear. Then another sound came from outside, clear through the cold morning air, a fence rail settling back into place. She rose quickly, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and opened the front door. The world outside was still dark, the mountains barely outlined against the gray edge of morning. Frost covered the yard in a thin white sheet, and Clara's breath turned to mist the moment she stepped onto the porch. Near the front fence, Samuel Reed was already working. He had found an old coil of rope, several bent nails, and a stack of weathered boards Clara had forgotten behind the shed. One section of fencing, weakened by wind and neglect, had leaned so far that one more storm might have taken it down completely. Samuel had pulled it upright, braced it with a post, and was tying the support tight with hands red from the cold. He looked up when he heard the porch board creak. "Morning, ma'am," he said, as if it were perfectly normal for a man who had arrived half-starved the night before to be repairing fences before sunrise. Clara stared at him. "You should still be resting." Samuel tightened the rope and tested the rail with one firm shake. It held. "Rest won't save a farm," he answered gently. "But an early hour might." The words stayed with her. After breakfast, Clara expected him to ask where to begin. Instead, Samuel walked the property as if he were reading a map written in broken boards, rusted hinges, and sagging roofs. He stopped at the barn first. His eyes moved along the beams, the weak corners, the places where the wind slipped through. He did not complain. He did not shake his head. He simply touched the wood, pressed his thumb into the soft places, and judged what could still be trusted. "We don't need to rebuild all of it," he said. "Not yet. We save what's strong, replace what's dangerous, and waste nothing." That was how Samuel worked. He measured before he cut. He pulled nails carefully so they could be used again. He chose each piece of wood as if it mattered, because on Clara's farm everything mattered. A board was not just a board. A nail was not just a nail. A length of rope, a strip of iron, a cracked handle from a broken tool, each one had a purpose if a person knew how to see it. By midday he had reinforced the worst part of the barn roof. By afternoon he had repaired a gate that had not closed properly since before Thomas died. When Clara brought water to him, she found him kneeling beside the old wagon near the shed, studying the broken wheel with a patience that almost made the wreck look ashamed of itself. "Everyone said it wasn't worth fixing," Clara told him. Samuel glanced up, a faint smile touching his tired face. "People say that about a lot of things before they look close enough." He took the wheel apart piece by piece. He salvaged iron from another useless frame, trimmed a wooden brace, reset the axle, and strengthened the rim until the wagon stood again. Not beautiful. Not new. But standing. Clara could hardly speak. For months she had seen only loss when she looked around the farm. Samuel saw possibilities hiding inside the damage. Over the next days that became his way. He mended crooked fences, cleared the stable, sorted tools, repaired doors, and turned piles of forgotten scrap into useful things. He never moved fast for the sake of looking busy. He moved with intention. Every hour had a task. Every task had a reason. And slowly, almost quietly, the farm began to look cared for again. Clara watched the change with a feeling she did not dare name at first. It was not rescue. Not yet. It was the first proof that ruin was not always the end of a thing. At first, Clara Whitaker only watched Samuel Reed work. She watched because she did not know what else to do. For 2 years, she had been the only pair of hands between the farm and complete ruin. Every broken thing called her name at once. Every problem felt urgent. A loose gate. A leaking roof. A hungry cow. A cracked fence post. A field that would not recover. A debt that would not wait. She had been running from fire to fire for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe. But Samuel did not run. That was the first thing Clara noticed. He would stand in the middle of the yard in the pale morning light, looking slowly from the barn to the field, from the corral to the shed, from the animals to the fence line. He did not panic. He did not curse the damage. He did not waste time mourning what should have been done months ago. Instead, he studied the farm as if every problem had a place and every place had an order. One morning Clara found him drawing lines in the dirt with a broken stick. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Sorting the day," Samuel said. He pointed first toward the corral. "That beam goes before the wagon. If it falls, the cattle get hurt." Then he pointed toward the feed shed. "That door comes next. If the wind keeps getting in, what little feed you have left will spoil faster." Finally, he nodded toward a crooked fence near the lower pasture. "That can wait until tomorrow. It looks bad, but it is still holding." Clara stared at the simple marks in the dirt. For months she had believed she was failing because she could not fix everything. Samuel showed her something different. A farm was not saved by doing everything at once. It was saved by knowing what would cost the most if left undone. That idea settled inside her slowly. At first it embarrassed her. She had lived on that land for years. She had worked it beside Thomas. She knew every corner of it, every slope, every stubborn stone near the field. Yet grief and fear had turned her own home into a maze. She had been so afraid of losing the farm that she had stopped seeing it clearly. Samuel never made her feel foolish for that. He never said, "You should have known." He never took the farm from her hands. Instead, he placed the work back into them in a way she could carry. When he repaired a hinge, he explained why that door mattered more than another. When he sorted the tools, he showed her which ones were worth saving and which were stealing space. When he measured a damaged board, he told her not only where it would go but why it should go there. His lessons were quiet, practical, and respectful. He spoke to her like a partner, not like a helpless widow. That changed something in Clara. She began walking the farm differently. Before sunrise she still made her rounds, but now her eyes searched for priority instead of disaster. She checked the animals first, then the feed, then the weakest structures. She made small plans and followed them. She stopped wasting strength on what merely looked frightening and gave her best hours to what truly threatened the farm. By the end of the week, her movements had steadied. Her shoulders no longer carried the same defeated bend. Her hands were still cracked from cold and work, but they no longer shook when she opened the barn door. She began asking questions, then making decisions before Samuel answered. Sometimes he only smiled and nodded, letting her see that she had chosen right. And with each small decision, Clara recovered a piece of herself. Not the woman she had been before Thomas died. That woman was gone, shaped forever by loss. But someone new was standing in her place. Someone quieter, stronger, less afraid of the next morning. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains and the repaired wagon stood beside the shed, Clara looked across the yard and realized the farm no longer felt like an enemy surrounding her. It felt like work. Hard work. Endless work. But work she could understand. Samuel came to stand beside her, wiping dust from his hands. "You see it now," he said. Clara kept her eyes on the barn, the fences, the animals moving under the fading light. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I do." For the first time in a long time, hope did not feel like a dream. It felt like a plan. The change did not come all at once. It came in small sounds. The scrape of a wooden chair pulled closer to the table. The soft clink of tin cups beside the stove. A child's sleepy voice asking for one more piece of cornbread. Another child laughing before he remembered to be careful. For 2 years, Clara Whitaker's house had held its breath. After Thomas died, every room had become too large. The kitchen table had looked wider than before. The hallway had stretched longer in the evenings. Even the fire seemed quieter, as if it knew there was no one left to warm but a woman too tired to sit beside it. Clara had grown used to eating alone, working alone, and ending each day with only the wind for company. But Noah and Caleb Reed did not understand how to keep a house silent. Not for long. At first, the boys moved like guests who were afraid of taking up space. They sat close to their father at meals. They asked permission before touching anything. Caleb carried his little cloth sack everywhere, even from the kitchen to the back room, as if the world might change its mind and leave him with nothing again. Noah tried to act brave, tried to help Samuel with small chores. Tried to stand like a man even though his cheeks were still thin and his eyes still carried the weariness of the road. Clara noticed all of it. So she fed them. Not lavishly. There was nothing lavish left on that farm. But she gave what she could. Warm milk in the morning, beans when the pot allowed it. Cornbread cut a little thicker than she first intended. Cheese wrapped in cloth and placed quietly on the table. She told herself the boys needed strength if Samuel was going to keep working. But the truth was gentler than that. She liked watching color return to their faces. By the 4th morning, Caleb smiled. It happened while Clara was stirring the pot over the stove. Noah had dropped a small piece of firewood and tried to catch it with his foot, only to hop backward and nearly bump into Samuel. Caleb pressed both hands over his mouth, fighting it at first. Then the laugh escaped him, quick and bright, filling the kitchen before anyone knew what to do with it. Samuel froze. Clara turned from the stove. Noah looked embarrassed for half a second, then started laughing too. And just like that, the house remembered joy. After that, the boys began to change faster. Noah helped gather eggs from the hens, carrying them with serious care as if he had been trusted with gold. Caleb followed behind him, proudly holding the basket even when there were only 2 eggs inside. They carried small bundles of kindling to the kitchen and stacked them unevenly near the stove. They ran across the yard when the sun came through the clouds, their boots kicking frost from the hard ground. Clara watched from the barn door more than once, her hands still full of work, her heart suddenly full of something she had not planned for. The farm sounded different with children on it. Their footsteps crossed the yard where only Clara's had been. Their voices rose near the old orchard. Their laughter startled the chickens and made Samuel look up from his repairs with a softness in his face that disappeared whenever he thought someone might see it. At night, the four of them ate together near the wood stove. The conversations were simple at first. Noah asked what Thomas had planted in the lower field. Caleb asked whether the cows had names. Samuel spoke little, but when he did, the boys listened. Clara answered more than she expected to. She told them which hen was mean, which gate stuck in the rain, which corner of the porch had always creaked even when Thomas was alive. Somewhere between those small questions and quiet answers, the old grief in the house loosened its grip. It did not leave. Grief never left that easily. But it moved aside enough for warmth to enter. One evening, Caleb fell asleep at the table, his cheek resting beside an empty cup of milk. Noah leaned against Samuel's shoulder, fighting sleep and losing. The fire cracked softly. Outside, winter still covered the fields. The debt still waited. Colonel Silas Blackwood had not disappeared. But Clara looked across the table at the tired father and his two sleeping boys, and the loneliness inside her no longer felt endless. For the first time since Thomas was buried, the house did not feel empty. It felt alive. The next discovery began on a morning so quiet that Clara Whitaker almost trusted it. The wind had softened overnight. The sky hung pale above the mountains and the frost on the yard shone like powdered glass. Noah and Caleb were still near the house, chasing each other between the woodpile and the porch, their laughter rising into the cold air. Samuel Reed had finished checking the cattle before sunrise, and Clara thought he would turn next toward the barn door that still needed new bracing. But instead he walked toward the far back of the property. It was a section Clara rarely visited anymore. The land there dipped behind a low ridge, half hidden by thorny brush, old stones and weeds that had grown wild for years. Thomas used to say the place had once mattered, but after his death Clara had stopped asking why. There had been too many visible problems to worry about forgotten corners. Samuel did not see it that way. He stopped near the slope and stood completely still. Clara, carrying a small basket of tools, watched him from several yards away. She had learned that look on his face. It was the same look he had worn before fixing the wagon, before saving the barn roof, before finding use in things everyone else had called worthless. "What is it?" she asked. Samuel crouched and pressed his palm against the ground. The earth was cold but not dry. While most of the farm lay stiff and brittle beneath winter, this patch held a strange softness. A few green plants pushed through the dead growth, small but stubborn, as if they were drinking from a secret the rest of the land had forgotten. Samuel rubbed the soil between his fingers. "This ground is holding water," he said. Clara frowned. "That cannot be. The creek runs far below this side. Water does not always show itself where people expect it." He rose and studied the slope, then the scattered stones, then the way the brush curved in a rough line toward the lower field. His eyes followed something Clara could not see. "Water leaves signs," he said quietly. "Even when it is hidden." They began clearing the brush. At first Clara thought they were chasing nothing more than hope. She pulled away weeds with numb fingers while Samuel shifted stones and scraped packed dirt from a shallow depression in the ground. Noah and Caleb soon appeared, eager to help, carrying twigs and small rocks away as if they had been given a mission of great importance. Hour by hour the forgotten place opened. Beneath the tangled growth, Clara saw stones that were not random at all. They sat in a line worn smooth by age, fitted with a care no accident could explain. Samuel knelt beside them and cleared more earth away. A narrow channel appeared, then another, both running from the hillside toward the fields below. Clara's breath caught. "Thomas never told me this was here." "Maybe he did not know how much was left," Samuel said. "Or maybe the years buried it before he had the chance to restore it." They followed the channel to a mound of rocks covered by moss and dirt. Samuel worked slowly now, with almost painful care. He removed one stone, then another. Caleb stopped laughing. Noah stood beside Clara, silent, sensing that something important was happening. Then the earth made a sound. Soft at first. A wet whisper. Samuel pulled away the last clump of packed mud, and from beneath the stones water seeped into the open air. A thin silver thread slipped down the rock face, trembled in the cold light, and began to run. Clara dropped to her knees. For a moment no one spoke. The water was not much, not yet. But it was real. It moved through the old channel like a memory waking up. Samuel cleared more mud, and the trickle strengthened, finding the path carved for it long before any of them had stood on that land. Clara covered her mouth with both hands. The dead fields, the thirsty animals, the shrinking feed, the fear that spring would come too late. All of it shifted in that single sound. Water. Hidden under weeds. Buried under years. Waiting behind stones while the farm nearly died above it. Samuel looked at Clara, his face tired, dirty, and lit with quiet certainty. "This is why the land never gave up completely," he said. It was still carrying life underneath. Clara stared at the water running through the old stone channel toward her fields. For the first time she understood that Thomas had been right. There was more value in this land than anyone could see. And now, at last, it was beginning to rise. The water did not save the farm in a single day. It began with a trickle. A narrow silver line moved through the old stone channel, weak at first, slipping over moss, dirt and roots that had been choking it for years. Clara Whitaker knelt beside it as if she were afraid to breathe too hard and make it vanish. Samuel Reed did not celebrate. Not yet. He simply rolled up his sleeves, wiped the mud from his hands and looked toward the lower fields. "Now we guide it," he said. That was how the next several days began. Before the sun climbed above the mountain, Samuel was already at the old channels, clearing mud, pulling weeds, shifting stones back into place. Clara worked beside him, her skirt damp at the hem, her hands numb from cold water and winter air. Noah and Caleb helped where they could, carrying small rocks, gathering straw and running messages between the spring and the barn with the proud seriousness of boys who had finally been trusted with something important. Slowly the hidden water remembered where to go. It ran first toward the animals. Samuel opened a shallow path beside the corral so the cattle could drink without Clara hauling every bucket by hand. The first time the cows lowered their heads to the fresh water, Clara stood with both hands pressed against her chest. It was such a simple thing, animals drinking, but to her it felt like a miracle, with hooves and breath and steam rising in the cold. Then the water reached the garden. The soil there had been stiff and tired, but after several days small signs of life began to appear. Not abundance. Not yet. But enough. A darker patch of earth, a blade of green pushing through. A stubborn leaf that had no business surviving the frost yet somehow did. Clara found herself checking those places every morning before anything else, as if the ground had begun answering her back. Samuel also changed the way they protected what remained. He moved the stored hay to a dry corner he had repaired himself, lifting it away from the damp floor and sealing the worst gaps in the wall. He taught Clara how to cut the better grass near the watered section without killing the roots, how to save part for later, how to stretch feed without starving the herd. Every lesson was small, practical and given without pride. A farm survives winter by thinking ahead, he told her. Not by hoping the cold shows mercy. So they stopped hoping for mercy. They built for survival. Around the most vulnerable garden beds, Samuel and Clara raised low barriers from scrapwood, straw and brush. They were not pretty, but they broke the wind. At night, when the frost came down hard from the mountain, those rough little walls held back just enough cold to keep the young plants from dying. In the mornings, Clara would lift the straw covering and find green still waiting underneath. Green? That color became sacred to her. Everywhere else in the region, winter kept tightening its grip. When Clara went into town for salt or flour, she heard the same stories again and again. A bean crop gone. A vegetable patch frozen. A farmer selling animals because he could no longer feed them. People spoke with the hollow voices of those counting losses faster than blessings. But when Clara returned home, she stepped into a different truth. Her farm was still wounded. The debt had not disappeared. Colonel Silas Blackwood was still waiting somewhere beyond the hills, believing hunger would do what his threats had not. But the land was no longer surrendering. Water ran through the old channels. The cattle stood stronger. The hay stayed dry. The garden held on. And the fields, though scarred by frost, no longer looked dead to Clara. They looked like something recovering. One evening, she stood beside Samuel near the lower pasture, watching the water glimmer faintly in the fading light. Noah and Caleb were laughing near the barn, carrying kindling much too proudly for boys their size. Smoke rose from the chimney. The cattle shifted quietly behind the fence. For the first time, Clara saw the whole farm, not as Thomas had left it and not as winter had broken it. She saw what it could become. Samuel looked at her and nodded toward the running water. She had life in her all along, he said. Clara smiled through tears. She did not bother to hide. No, she whispered. She was waiting for us to find it. The first neighbor came just after noon, carrying shame in both hands. She was a widow from the other side of the ridge, a thin woman named Ruth Miller, wrapped in a faded brown shawl with 2 empty jars tucked against her chest. Clara Whitaker saw her standing near the gate, not stepping in, not calling out, just waiting as if she expected to be turned away. Clara knew that kind of waiting. It was the posture of a person who had already asked the world for help and been made to regret it. Samuel Reed was repairing a storage shelf near the barn when Clara crossed the yard. Noah and Caleb stopped gathering kindling and watched from the porch. "Mrs. Miller," Clara said gently. "What brings you out in this cold?" The woman's lips trembled before she spoke. "My grandchildren," she said. "They haven't had milk in 2 days." That was all. No long explanation. No polished request. Just the truth, raw and small enough to break a heart. Clara looked toward the barn where her own cattle now stood stronger because the hidden water had reached them. The farm was not rich. Not even close. The debt still hung over her like storm clouds. Colonel Silas Blackwood still waited somewhere beyond the valley, hoping she would stumble. Every choice still mattered. But Clara remembered a night not long ago when 2 hungry boys had sat at her table gripping cups of milk like they were holding life itself. She took the jars from Ruth's hands. "Come inside and warm yourself," she said. By sunset Ruth walked home with milk, a small bundle of cornbread and tears she kept wiping away with the corner of her shawl. The next day a farmer and his wife came from a lower field near the creek. Their bean crop had been ruined by frost. They had no seed worth planting when spring returned and no money to buy more. Clara listened while Samuel stood quietly beside her, his face thoughtful. They could not give much. But they gave enough. A cloth sack of seed saved from Thomas's old stores. Advice on where to plant first when the ground softened. A promise that Samuel would show them how to shield the young rows from the bitter mountain wind. After them came an old goat farmer named Walter Briggs who had almost no feed left for his animals. He did not ask for charity. Men like him never did. He stood by the corral, turning his hat in his hands, talking around the problem until Clara finally saved him the burden. "You need feed," she said. His eyes lowered. "Yes, ma'am." Samuel took him to the dry shed where the hay had been stacked safely away from dampness. They measured out what the farm could spare. Not enough to make Walter comfortable. Enough to keep his animals alive. Word began to move through the valley. Not fast at first. Hope rarely travels loudly. It passes from one kitchen table to another, from a church step to a store counter, from a man returning home with seed in his pocket to a woman boiling milk for grandchildren who slept hungry the night before. People began coming to Clara's farm not because she had become powerful but because she had remained human. Some left with food, some left with seed. Some left with nothing more than Samuel's patient advice, the kind of practical wisdom that cost him no coin but could save a family weeks of loss. He showed them how to raise windbreaks from brush and scrap wood. He explained how to keep stored grain dry, how to protect a garden bed from frost, how to look at land not as a problem but as something speaking in signs. He never acted like a master teaching fools. He worked beside them. He answered questions with patience. He let tired farmers see that survival was not magic. It was care, order, and refusing to waste what could still be used. And Clara watched something larger than her farm begin to change. The place people once called doomed became a place they walked toward when they had nowhere else to go. The widow they had pitied became the woman they trusted. Not because she had more than they did but because she gave from what little she had without tying a debt around anyone's neck. That was what made her different from Silas Blackwood. And far away in his fine house Silas heard the same rumors. Clara's farm was producing again. Neighbors were praising her name. The stranger she had taken in was helping others stand. For the first time in years people were looking toward Clara's gate instead of his. And that, more than the water, more than the crops, more than the cattle growing strong again, was what Silas Blackwood could not forgive. Silas Blackwood did not strike like a man with courage. He struck like a man who feared the truth. The first blow came before sunrise. Clara Whitaker stepped outside with a milk pail in her hand and found the back fence torn down across the lower pasture. Not broken by wind. Not weakened by age. Torn down. 3 posts had been pulled from the frozen ground, rails split in half, and hoofprints cut deep into the mud where someone had ridden away in the dark. Samuel Reed crouched beside the damage, running his hand over the splintered wood. "This was done by men," he said quietly. Clara looked toward the road. Her stomach tightened but she did not ask who. They both knew. By noon 2 cows were missing. Noah found the open gate first and came running so fast he could hardly breathe. Samuel followed the tracks to the edge of the woods, then stopped. The prints vanished where the ground turned rocky, as if whoever had taken the animals knew exactly how to hide a trail. Clara stood beside him, fighting the old fear that tried to crawl back into her chest. For months winter had tried to starve her out. Now Silas was trying to frighten her out, but fear was no longer the only thing living on that farm. That evening 3 neighbors arrived without being asked. Walter Briggs brought a coil of rope. Ruth Miller brought her oldest son. Another farmer came with 2 lanterns and a shotgun he never lifted, but everyone saw it. Together they repaired the fence before dark. No one spoke Silas Blackwood's name, but his shadow stood among them anyway. The next attack came through whispers. By the end of the week the town had a new story to chew on. Samuel Reed, the stranger Clara had taken in, was not a helper at all. He was a thief. A runaway. A man who had tricked a lonely widow so he could take her land when she was weakest. Some said his children were part of the act. Others claimed he had been seen hiding papers, maps, and old records in places no honest man would need to hide anything. Clara heard the rumors at the general store. This time she did not lower her eyes. She placed her coins on the counter, looked straight at the men, pretending not to watch her, and said, "The only man trying to steal from me is the one spreading those lies." No one laughed. That night Samuel moved the hidden chest again. Inside it were the old deeds, maps, land records, and sealed papers they had found behind the stone wall on the far side of the property. Those documents had changed everything. They proved the fight was no longer about one small farm. It was about land inheritance and a truth buried for decades beneath another family's fortune. Silas must have known. Or feared enough to guess. Then came the fire. Just after midnight, Caleb woke screaming. Smoke was crawling under the kitchen door. Clara ran outside barefoot, her shawl barely around her shoulders, and saw orange light licking up the side of the feed shed. Samuel was already moving. He shouted for Noah to wake the neighbors, then grabbed a bucket and plunged it into the water channel they had restored with their own hands. Clara joined him. Bucket after bucket, water, steam, smoke, sparks flying into the black sky. For one terrible moment, she thought they would lose it all. Then neighbors appeared from the darkness. Men and women formed a line from the channel to the shed, passing buckets until their arms shook. By dawn the fire was out. The shed was charred, but the feed had survived. Near the back wall, Samuel found a broken oil flask and boot prints leading toward the road. Clara held Caleb against her while the boy trembled. Samuel looked at the tracks and his face hardened in a way Clara had never seen. Silas had crossed from pressure into war. The confrontation came the next afternoon. A cloud of dust rose from the road and several riders appeared at the gate. Silas Blackwood sat at the front on a dark horse, his coat clean, his face sharp with anger. Behind him were men carrying ropes, clubs, and tools. He did not bother with courtesy. "Hand over the chest," he said. Clara stood on the porch, calm in a way that made him look smaller. "What chest?" Silas's eyes narrowed. "The one containing documents stolen from my family." Samuel stepped down beside Clara. "No one enters this farm without her permission," he said. Silas smiled, but there was no power left in it. Only panic, wearing a gentleman's clothes. Around the gate, neighbors began to gather. Quietly, one by one. The very people Clara had helped through the winter now stood as witnesses. Silas saw them. And for the first time he understood that Clara Whitaker was no longer alone. Clara Whitaker did not open the chest with shaking hands anymore. She opened it like a woman finally ready to face the truth. Inside were old deeds, maps, and family records proving what Thomas had tried to protect all along. The farm was not a small, forgotten piece of land. It was part of a much larger inheritance that Silas Blackwood had been trying to steal for years. The water, the hidden channels, the rich soil beyond the ridge, all of it belonged to Clara by right. When the documents were read before the townspeople, Silas had nothing left but anger. His threats turned hollow. His power cracked in front of the same people who once feared speaking his name. The man who had tried to bury a widow under debt and winter was exposed by the very land he wanted to take. And Clara was no longer alone. Samuel stood beside her. Noah and Caleb held her hands as if they had belonged there all along. The farm Thomas had loved was breathing again, not just with water and crops but with laughter, warmth, and family. The lesson is simple but powerful: never mistake someone's hardship for weakness. Sometimes the people who look broken are only buried under storms they were never meant to face alone. Kindness can open a gate, faith can uncover hidden water, and courage can turn a dying farm into a home again. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments, have you ever seen kindness change someone's life? And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story may remind you that hope often arrives when we least expect it.